So, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure today to welcome my friend and colleague Sinan Richards to this YouTube channel. We, of course, have been spending a lot of time thinking about various facets of Lacanian theory on this channel, but increasingly what we're also trying to do is think a little bit about um, questions pertaining to Lacan's work in its relationship to Fanon. I got a little snuck a little picture of a Fanon book cover in the background to give us that flavor. So thanks so much for joining us, Sinan. It's wonderful that you're here. Just a brief word of introduction. Sinan has just recently published a fantastic book called The Dialectics of Love in Sartre and Lacan, although we're not talking about that too much today. And he is also the person who has written this much annotated article, which is entitled The Logician of Madness, Fanon's Lacan. So we'll probably touch a little bit on that today. It's a brilliant piece of scholarship. I would recommend, if you're interested in thinking about the relationship between Fanon and Lacan, it's a great place to start. It's a great place to start because of a number of things. Number one, Sinan investigates, we'll ask him about this, how early Lacan had a pivotal influence on early Fanon, but he's also interested in how Fanon has potentially influenced Lacan. And his work brings a real scholarly historical sensibility to an area of scholarship which I think sometimes has been put to one side. There's been a tendency in some Fanonian scholarship to not really want to engage with the Lacanian material. And Sinan has done a really tremendous job about that. So thanks so much for joining us, Sinan.
Thank you so much, Derek. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me on. And just to add, actually, that it's actually your work and your papers that people should read before mine, as a kind of baseline to understand what's at stake.
Oh, thank you, Sinan. That's very nice of you. One place that might be useful for us to begin, and I know you've been doing some work in this area, is one of the most extensive moments in Fanon's work where he cites Lacan is obviously the famous footnote on the mirror stage. This is a useful entry point, I think, not only because you're doing work in that area, but because for most people with a rudimentary beginning understanding of Lacan, they will have done something with the mirror stage. So this footnote goes on for a little while. A number of commentators have taken up various facets of it, but I know you've been engaging with it, thinking through the implications of this footnote. So what can you tell us about this crucial moment in Fanon's work where he is citing Lacan and the notion of the mirror stage?
So I think that it's important to kind of place Lacan in context, first of all, and to understand how the actual concept of the mirror stage emerges in the context of the kind of really early Lacan. In order to then understand how it is that Fanon utilizes the concept for his own aims, because what he's doing is very much adapting, as it were, Lacan's concept. So I think probably wise to begin at least with the doctoral thesis from 1932, because although the mirror stage is missing in 1932, the mirror stage comes to respond to something that Lacan felt was missing in that thesis. So the mirror stage ultimately boils down to a question of trying to understand the formation of the personality. And Lacan gives he attempts to answer this question in the doctoral thesis, but at least from his perspective, not very well. And so the mirror stage does something above and beyond the 1932 text to explain, or better explain, what it is that he was trying to do in 1932. So the 1932 text remains crucial. And as I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later on, it's fundamental for Fanon, both in Black Skin, White Masks, but crucially the doctoral dissertation. Just a quick note, actually, a small side note on the doctoral dissertation. The thesis has, Lacan's thesis has a bit of a mythical status in the kind of psychiatric circles at the time. Someone, for example, like François Tosquiès, smuggled a copy of Lacan's doctoral dissertation from Spain when he arrived in France, and then worked at the Saint-Aubin hospital. And actually, it was at Saint-Aubin that the patients kind of prepared homespun copies of the thesis, of Lacan's thesis, and then sold them in the local market. So the position of Lacan's doctoral dissertation is actually quite important, because Fanon then spends 16 months at Saint-Olban with Tosquiès. And Tosquiès ran seminars on Lacan's doctoral thesis, both in Catalan, at the university that he was in the Catalan region, and also at Saint-Olban. So we know that Tosquiès writes with Fanon, and we'll discuss this a bit more when we do the psychiatric work, but there's a kind of very important, the way that Lacan's thesis was received, not amongst necessarily clinical orthodox psychiatrists, but amongst a kind of more eclectic bunch of psychoanalytically inflected or interested people, was a kind of mythical status. And that's partly because of what he tries to do in the thesis, and partly because of the way that he positioned himself against a psychiatric establishment that seemed immovable at the time. So Lacan was very much a figure in 1932 who's trying to push at the boundaries of kind of dogma and psychiatric dogma at the time. Now, I'm aware that I prefaced all this because we're talking about the mirror stage, and I think we have to get the kind of chronology right. So 1932, this doctoral dissertation, surrealist implications that you've written about and spoken about before. And then there's 1934, and a psychiatrist called Henri Wallon writes a book where he talks a bit about the kind of child mirror identification scene that in turn influences Lacan. But it's not until 1936 that Lacan then kind of begins writing about the mirror stage as we've come to know it. So about 5 or 6 years after the doctoral dissertation, Lacan was very much thinking of the mirror stage as a way to respond to himself, to better explain a question of the formation of the personality. So in 1936, Lacan gives 2 talks. He gives one at the Société Psychoanalytique de Paris, which is just the Parisian psychoanalytic school, and one at the IPS Congress in Marienbad. And we don't, obviously, this is very famous Lacanian history, but we don't actually have the text that Lacan gave in 1936 to the Congress at Marienbad. And we know that what happened at that Congress kind of disgruntled Lacan quite a bit, because Ernst Jones cut Lacan off after 10 minutes and wouldn't let him finish his paper on the mirror stage. So we don't have any information about that. Lacan was very reticent to publish that piece in 1936, but we do have access through Françoise Dolto's notes of the one he gave 3 weeks earlier at the Société Psychoanalytique de Paris. And she takes a whole series of notes. And what I found really interesting going through those notes was the emphasis that Lacan places on what he calls symbolism. And it seems remarkable to me that as early as 1936, Lacan was talking about symbolism, which I think we can take to mean the symbolic. So that's how the kind of mirror stage ends when he's talking about it. And then there's also a relation to the visual. So he's very clear about the visual impact and the importance of the mirror stage. I think that those 2 things we need to think about quite clearly when we talk about Fanon, because I think that those are the 2 aspects that Fanon adopts when he's talking about his concept of the mirror stage. So 1936, right after the kind of the bad experience that Lacan had with Ernst Jones at the IPS Congress in Marienbad, he rushes off to Berlin for the Olympic Games, and obviously witnessed firsthand kind of nationalist zealotry, Nazi party zealotry. And according to Rudnesco and a few other witnesses, their testimony, Lacan was disgusted by what he saw. And someone called Philippe Julien, who's a psychoanalyst in France, has written a bit about how this context links the mirror stage, at least in Lacan's mind, to questions of racism. So it's important to keep in mind this kind of general framework about what the mirror stage could do for questions of racism, and how this idea comes to Fanon. Now, I just want to quickly say a few things, and feel free to cut me off, Derek, if this is too much, but I just want to say a few things about the material that Fanon had access to, because we know that, so there's the 36 notes which Fanon wouldn't have had access to, but Lacan's quite clear in the Écrit that whatever he said in 1936, he's put into in a kind of diminished form in his article on the family from 1938. So the article on the family from 1938 contains the kind of main nuggets of what it is that he was trying to say about the mirror stage. And Fanon has access to that article and cites it. He also has access to a few texts. One of them is the Aggressivity in Psychoanalysis text, which was published in the Journal of the Society for Psychoanalytic Studies in Paris. And it's actually interesting because this journal that this society publishes, Fanon cites quite a few different texts at different times in Black Skin, White Masks. And it's clear that Fanon had access to issue 2, issue 3 from 1948 and 49. And incidentally, that's where Lacan also publishes the mirror stage as it is in the Écrit. So actually, it transpires that Fanon had quite a few bits of Lacan, written Lacan. We know that he had the doctoral dissertation, probably through the library in Lyon, or failing that, probably through Tusquets or through someone like Merleau-Ponty. We know that he had access to the Family Complexes article. We know he had access to the presentation of psychical causality paper, which we might talk about a bit later on. And we know he had aggressivity in psychoanalysis. And we know that he also had, I think, potentially the final 1949 text on the mirror stage that Lacan republishes in the Écrit. So we're talking about a Fanon in 1952 who has a pretty good understanding of how the mirror stage, what it is, first of all, and how it's linked in many ways to the early Lacan and this question of thinking about formations of personalities. Now, I think when we come to think about Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, there's a remarkable connection I see between this concept of formation of the personality, mirrors, and colonization and the impact of oppressive colonizing environments. I think at one point Fanon even says that the Black Antillan who goes to France, in going to France, activates the final stage of their personality. And that's the kind of language that he uses to mean that in arriving in France and in being confronted with white people who don't see that person as Black, who doesn't see them as white as well, sorry, I meant to say, something shifts, right? And there's a kind of instability that emerges in that kind of relation. And I think that when Fanon is making these kind of statements, he's thinking very much about Lacan's concept of the mirror stage. So in this very long footnote, which is slap bang in the middle of that chapter on psychopathology, Fanon dedicates 1,200 words, as you mentioned, to kind of think through the implications of Lacan's concept of the mirror stage as it pertains to his kind of understanding of the colonial situation. And in it, he kind of picks up the traditional Lacanian themes. We're talking about alienation, we're talking about diverted alienation, we're talking about the desire of the other, we're talking about the kind of illusion of coherence And all of these elements of the Lacanian mirror stage as they pertain to the formation of personality emerges and bubbles up in these 1,200 words. So he says, and I'm being very quick, I know, but he says essentially that there's a kind of double instance, there's a kind of double movement in the mirror. So the black child, Fanon says, would see in the reflection a white child. And what he means by that, I think, is that the total colonizing environment within which Black colonized people live forces them to articulate all their desires and dreams, what we would call kind of symbolic structuring, within the language of colonization. So the white man's speech, and I think that Fanon spends a long time talking about the importance of language and how people who, kind of Black colonized Antillians who go to France come back and they speak in a different way. They try and adopt the language of Parisians. They try and speak in a kind of classic French way. And so there's a kind of sense in which there's not only a hierarchy of language, but there's an eradication of anything that might be not pure enough in terms of the relationship with the colonizer. And I think that that's precisely what Fanon means when he says that the visual impact of this mirror image is that you see yourself as white. And it's not until that you go to France or you go to the West or you go to the place that colonized you that you realize your position is fundamentally not white. And so that's clear. There's alienation, there's illusory coherence, there's all the elements of the mirror stage that they kind of hold pretty well. And I think that Fanon, when he talks about the white child, makes a slightly different argument, but also an interesting one. He says that the white child who sees themselves in the mirror sees themselves as not Black, in the sense that the way that kind of the desire of the colonizer is to be not that, which I find is an interesting concept because it's, again, illusory and institutes a symbolic framework, which then enables the very colonization to continue, the ritual dehumanization, for example, of the colonized. So we can see that the kind of mirror stage is a very complicated moment in Fanon's text, but actually acts as a kind of connecting element to all the aspects, I think, in Black Skin, White Masks. It picks up the stuff on language, it picks up the stuff on the relationship with colonization and the view of the colonized as it pertains to the colonizer, and it institutes it in a very neat formula. And the neat formula provides us with a view of the subject of colonization and the subject of the colonizer. And I think that, for Lacan, for example, he's talking very much about the mirror stage as something which will then give us an entry point into the Oedipus complex. And I think that for Fanon, it's very clear that the reason why there can't be an Oedipus complex that affects Black subjectivity is precisely because they're not seeing, they're seeing oppression in the mirror as opposed to just the normal desire of the other, if that makes sense. But we can discuss that a bit more.
I mean, what's so helpful in what you've said is it signals a whole series of ideas. One is sometimes I've wanted to play with the idea that what is the Fanonian mirror stage? And you could say that the Fanonian mirror stage is actually the theory of epidermalization, which is developed within Black Skin, White Masks. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that, but just what seems to be crucial, in part at least, is how something of the mirror stage is significant to Fanon, because visuality, identity, visual field, desire in relationship to imagery, and also the taking on of an image. Now, I know our existential and Sartrean colleagues, of whom you're one, actually, Sinan, will say, don't forget, it's not just Lacan who's making influence here, it's also Sartre. So just to note that. But the prevalence of the visual field, the prevalence of being fixed and being seen in the visual field, which in some ways maybe sounds more Sartre than Lacan, but whatever. But the crucial factor of taking on of an image, very Lacanian, and I think you've described it very well. One of the things that I wanted to call attention to is in how you describe it, it very much reminds me of a reference which is not particularly Lacanian, but comes from social psychology in the history of the experimental social psychology tradition in the United States, where Kenneth and Mamie Clark do the famous doll studies. And what they show, there's been a lot of stuff written about them. Maybe people say there's methodological flaws in it, but they're very striking studies. Because if you, or as they did, if you present a young Black child at a certain time with a doll or two dolls, and you say, well, which doll is the good doll? Which one is like you? Which one do you want? And they have a white doll and a black doll. The kid is often in this terrible situation, and some of the most memorable footage from these experiments is this heart-rending situation when the black child picks a white doll, which sounds like a very Fanonian dilemma, as you've just described, about who one thinks, or not necessarily who one thinks one is, maybe a little bit that, but which image do you opt to take on? So I just wanted to thank you for connecting those dots for me. But one of the things I think you also really nicely foreground, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there's two whitenesses in the image. So if the Black child, if I'm understanding how you're conveying this to us in Fanon's terms, both the Black child and the white child have a mirror image. For the Black child, the idealized model of identification, as in the Clark's experiment, is presumably the image of the white child. And there's all the passages in Fanon, I'm running through the cheeks and I've got blush, all that stuff. My cheeks are blushing, and this identification with the place of whiteness. So we see that there we would have the mirror image, or the idealized, desirous perhaps prototype image with whom I should identify with is the white child. So this is one. But when the white child looks in the mirror, they also see an image of a white child. But this image, the whiteness here, seems to be defined by its not being Black. So I suppose I was just curious about those two things. One is an image of an idealized, culturally normative, and indeed, for conditions of racism, image of whiteness. And another is an image of whiteness, which is kind of most fundamentally an image of not Blackness. What comes to mind to you about those? Are they the same? Do they overlap? What else could we say about that?
And I think that that's a really interesting question. I don't necessarily have a good answer, but I think that an answer could possibly lie in the way that Fanon thinks about discussing whiteness within Black skin, white masks. I think, the kind of colonizer, at least. And I think what's striking about the fact that the white child sees a not Black child is that it institutes the relationship, at least in a kind of negative foundation, right? So there's a sense in which the desire of the white child is to be not the Black child, but that desire comes from the desire of the other, which is presumably the desire of the parents or the desire of society at large. It's an interesting one, but I think my question is, to what extent are they two different modes, and not just two different facets of the same oppression?
Yeah.
And I think I'm slightly thinking here of when Fanon talks about the experience of women within a kind of colonial paradigm and why that they might be racist as well. And he says something to the effect that women are subjugated by the very colonial oppression that they then put onto the colonized, and therefore enjoy, in a sense, the kind of humiliation of the colonized. So I think that what's going on here is obviously a very complicated dialectical movement, in Fanon. And I don't think that I've quite resolved the antagonism. Firstly, why the double vision, given that both the white child and the black child are living within the same reality. And what I mean by that is that they're both subject to the same system structure, but on two sides of the divide. So on the one side, the kind of structural symbolic apparatus that keeps them within their position of privilege, and then on the other side, one that does not. But what kind of structural analysis does that form for thinking about, talking about kind of disalienation, for example? And does that concept of disalienation connect also to the white child? And what's the status of the white child? Is it just quote unquote the Lacanian mirror stage? Is the articulation fully within a psychoanalytic paradigm as Lacan would have it? Those are the kind of questions that I'm struggling with at the moment, because I think that for Fanon, all discussions of kind of Black subjectivity within the paradigm of colonialism means that it's always going to be a dead end. I think that's what he's saying. He's saying, you always come to the end of the line where what you see very clearly is the horizon of colonization, the horizon of oppression, the horizon of actually, in effect, no horizon at all. And I think we can say to a certain extent that, Fanon, that's why Fanon thinks that psychoanalysis is not necessarily that useful when thinking about Black subjectivity, but he's very much not thinking that psychoanalysis is not helpful. It's that, the very foundation of kind of colonization needs to change in order to enable a kind of subjectivity, as far as I've understood it. And that enabling of a subjectivity would open a space to then be able to think about the unconscious. I think at one point he says, the Black man doesn't have the material means or the time to unconsciousize their self.